Hello everyone, my name is Sasha Ritchie. I am a licensed social worker and the training manager here at Foster Kinship. And this video is going to be an informative video on understanding the resources, the legal options, the financial options for kinship relative caregivers who do not have any CPS or foster care involvement. So let's go through our learning objectives. So by the end of this training, you'll be able to understand navigating the system when the child welfare system looks informal, meaning there is no foster care or CPS professional entity that's involved in the family. We're going to learn about the unique challenges faced by informal families, discuss what financial options there are for any level of aid that children may need while in relative care. What are their legal options on providing their legal capacity for children, and then the level of emotional support that's needed for families who don't have access to child welfare in the same capacity as those who are involved with the foster care system. And then we'll wrap up with practical resources and how to support informal kinship families. So first thing is first. So the concept of caring for minor children of a loved one is not a unique or new concept at all. It actually is really common for families to step in and care for their loved ones' minor children when parents are unable to do so. And so navigating the system is basically trying to go forward in a path that is unclear, with no restrictions really, or no level of supervision provided to both the parents and to that caregiver on how the child can safely go back to their parents, right? Those are some of those challenges that we'll explore a little bit more about. And so it's basically navigating a path that's unpaved. It's going off-roading a little bit to put it in the most simplest terms, right? Common reasons for lack of access to a formalized system of support: families may need to hear options to care multiple times before they can make an informed decision. One of the biggest things that I do when I am working with a family who comes to foster kinship and says, I need help. I'm a grandparent, I'm an older sister, I'm an older brother, I'm aunt, I'm uncle, and parents have left their children in my care and I don't know what to do. One of the biggest things that I first do is we just sit down, we talk about the situation, we make sure to build trust with the families. And basically from there, we have to now begin to understand and unravel what has let this child into their home and what options they're going to have, if any sometimes, and we'll discuss that on how they can manage either this caregiving situation short-term, long-term, right? And what it looks like if the kids would like to go back to their parents or the parents would like their kids back at something. What does that all look like? For a lot of our caregivers, they're very much thrown into this. It's nothing that they have prepared for. They may have been simply babysitting the children and parents just never came and picked the kids back up, right? So there's a lot of emotional distress that's involved in, well, now what do I do? Now what do I do? I don't have their birth certificates. I don't have social security numbers. I don't even know how to go about having any sort of legal capacity for caring for the children. How do I have conversations with school? How do I take them to the doctor's office? There's so many different factors to think about when we're caring for children who are in our homes and we didn't anticipate for them to be in our homes for so long. There's high stress levels that can affect one's ability to access needed resources and process information. Trying to decipher court paperwork or even how to get guardianship, the difference between the guardianship options, what does that even look like with a court hearing, all the different steps to leading to the court hearing. It's a lot of information that is thrown at the caregiver, which I try to break down step by step when I'm working. Say, break it down into 3 different steps when we're discussing guardianship or even discussing alternatives to guardianship. So let's get into the unique challenges that these families have, centered around their home, around their family systems, and they're navigating a system that is very blurry and unclear right now. So financial adequacy is a big factor here. A lot of our caregivers, they do not care for these children for any financial aid, right? Like they are doing this because they really feel like no one else is going to step in and care for the kids. If it's not them, then who it is, right? So they're not doing it for the money. And you'll really quickly see within this presentation and this training that there's a huge lack of access to any financial aid to begin with. So the concept of you're taking care of this child for the money needs to be thrown out the window because there's really no money. So financial adequacy. So what is this? What a household looks like when they take in a child? One of the things we see is a lot of our caregivers are on a fixed income or a low income and have a question mark around their employment status, which means that they may be employed, but now they're going to have to look at, okay, what is childcare, right? If you're a full-time employed individual who previously had no kids to kind of like factor into your job, now you're going to have to think about, okay, well, childcare is really expensive. How do I go about doing this, right? We're looking at a lot of folks who are retired, right? They're in their golden years where they're ready to transition from that work life to now being retired and enjoying their years now. And that's kind of stripped away from them. And now they're really on a fixed income because retirement, pensions, and Social Security is not a lot, right? It's definitely not set up to be able to provide for children and care for them day-to-day, everyday needs that they have financially. Emotional preparedness. So one of the things that we run into is it's a lot of grandparents that are caring informally for children, right? And age is something that we factor in. We have to have a really serious conversation about the long-term impacts of being a caregiver to a child in a system that there is no oversight, right? What happens to that child when the caregiver passes away? That's a huge burden of thinking on the caregiver, and our kids question it too. Our kids have often expressed to their caregivers, well, what's going to happen to me when you're not here, right? Kids are smart. They pick up on these things and they definitely know what's going on. There's chronic illnesses that may be involved that we have to take into account, life-changing challenges of unexpectedly raising a child, and then seeking medical care for the child. A lot of the kids that come into their relatives' homes don't have Medicaid or don't have private health insurance that their parents had set up for them, right? That was a huge barrier roadblock that the parents may have run into as well. Educational or difficulties assessing trauma-informed caregiving. So what this looks like is for the caregiver who is maybe just now getting to interact with this child, or maybe has babysitted the child prior, or has taken care of the child when they were younger, and now the child may be getting older, right? Understanding their intellectual disabilities, understanding how are they doing academically, right? Like what are going to be their learning challenges or some of those different developmental milestones that kids should be meeting, but perhaps they're not meeting due to previous adversities prior to coming into their home, or if they're born exposed to any substance. That can also impact brain development. There's a lot of different health components that the caregiver may not even know to address, because a lot of the times they're really stressed out emotionally and they're more so really worried how am I this work financially. Okay? So there's challenges in getting kids enrolled in school, especially if they don't have birth certificates, they don't have social security numbers, they don't have access to legal, getting them legal paperwork to establish things that school need, right? Childcare is a huge barrier, not just for grandparents, but also just any relative caregivers and parents as well. Childcare is extremely expensive, and the options for childcare subsidies, which we'll talk about what that looks like, it's not wonderful. It's not great. There's no systemic oversight, and then there's a lot of different levels of safety concerns that can be presented to the children, the caregivers, and the parents that we have to now begin to think about. The financial resources for income. As I mentioned earlier, there's not a whole lot of financial resources that's going to be applicable to our caregivers. But we'll take a look at what it does look like. So perhaps they may have access to stamps, which is SNAP, and it's going to be through welfare. Now, I will tell you that trying to obtain food stamps is, though not difficult, it's really strict. The guidelines are surrounded by really strict income guidelines, and not a lot of people can meet the income guideline. You basically have to have next to nothing income-wise in order to be able to access food stamps in Park County. Again, through welfare, the caregiver may have access to what is called child-only TANF. Child-only TANF is for blood relatives only. And then it is still centered around income, again, because this is welfare. Now, it's a little bit easier to meet the income guidelines for child-only TANF. The parameters set are a lot easier, and on many of our households that we work with, many of our families that we serve do meet the income guidelines. And we are able to assist them in getting them applied for child-only TANF. But we also have caregivers that are family friends, right? You can be a godparent that has taken in a child with no CPS involvement, and you would not have access to this service because, again, you have to be able to show that you are actually a blood relative. We sometimes have the biological parents, step parents, or ex-spouses or partners or something like that, right? Where there's a huge bond between that caregiver and the child, and that child may recognize this adult caregiver as their parent, right? If they're step parent, as their grandparent, if they're godparents, right? Whatever that family-like relationship is, it's still not recognized in the welfare system, in the child welfare system, or in financial level of capacity when you're trying to get aid. For grandparents, they have access to what's called kinship care payment. And this is also past parameters. You still have to meet an income guideline and an age requirement where you have to be 62 years or older. Now, for child-only TANF, the amount is $418, and then for every additional child, it's $60. That is not a lot of monthly stipends to get everything the children need, right? It makes a little bit of sense for biological parents, right? If they were able to access any aid like this, that's still, some help is better than no help, because welfare is really meant to be a supplemental situation, right? To really like just help you get by. But for kinship caregivers, when you are receiving retirement or you're receiving SSI, things like that, that are perhaps somewhere between $700 to $800 a month, an additional $418 a month is still not adequate enough to always get everything that the kids need, especially when the kids may have come to the caregiver's home with next to nothing, right? Because it was perhaps really meant to be just like a temporary babysitting situation. And now that caregiver has no access to clothing, no access to diapers, formulas, depending on the age group they're caring for, right? Just a lot of those like everyday necessities that if you are a parent or if you are a caregiver, you're buying on a regular basis. All of those different levels of needs add up. They cost a lot of money, especially now in 2022, as we're coming through the pandemic. We do see a rise of influx of food, shortage on baby formula, prices on diapers increasing, right? It's cost of living is increasing, and we cannot expect a grandparent with an income of $1,000 or $1,200 to be able to simply get by when they're taking care of children who may have come to their home with nothing. It's just unreasonable. In the foster kinship side of things, when we do come across families who are in need of these services, we have a pre-screening that we do. It's accessible on our website, but of course we can just talk to the caregiver and assess them through conversation as well. If you're wondering about what happens with godparents, right? Those are considered fictive kin caregivers. Fictive kins are, of course, they have an immense bond and a relationship with that child, maybe has been previously caring for the child, but is not a blood relative. That is a fictive kin caregiver. What access do they have to financial resources if CPS is not involved? There is no access to any financial resources are not a blood. And very quickly within this meeting, I'm sure you will see the discrepancies, how the system kind of lacks to recognize how we have the same type of family with the same needs. One can be a blood relative and have access to these resources. Same situation is occurring here. The needs are all the same, and the caregiver is not a blood relative and has access to nothing. So it really doesn't make sense at all. Another thing that I try to do is not every child that comes into a relative's home needs to have CPS. And we need to recognize that, right? There's some unique situations that occur in perhaps the parent has passed away, and then a guardianship is needed now, right? With the grandparents stepping into caring for grandchildren, or an aunt or an uncle stepping in, that birth parent has passed away. They may have access to survivors benefits or disability for children through the Social Security Administration. And that is something that cannot happen too quickly, unfortunately, because you do have to first establish legal guardianship. And we'll talk about the timeline on how long it may take to establish guardianship. But even though that resource is there, there's other steps to getting that service. Childcare options for informal families. So in Clark County, we do have Urban League. Urban League is a childcare subsidy program that can provide a percentage of childcare costs to be paid for to the relative caregiver. It is still based off of the family's income, and it's only good for 1 year. So again, not that great, right? I'm not sure what 1 year of childcare subsidy will do when you're caring for children, possibly long-term for years, right? We have Oscillator Learning Center for eligible families. I believe their income guidelines are a lot more manageable to meet in terms of trying to get services through them, but they do have an age requirement. Your child has to be, I believe, 3 years or older to access their learning center. And then next we have Sunrise Children's Foundation. also for eligible families, and their eligibility requirements are a little bit more manageable and more accessible to meet for families. And so those are some of the options. There may be more that we haven't discovered yet, right? Because not everything that is resource related may be identified or advertised in Clark County, but so far this is, as far as I know, the most level of childcare that we kind of have in our state. For healthcare options, we have medical options for informal families through Medicaid. This is a Medicaid HMO plan that's offered by the Division of Health and Human Services, and you apply through welfare. I think their plans recently changed, and each year their requirements change as well, so keep that in mind. But some of their plans include Health Plan in Nevada, which oftentimes I have heard through a few different caregivers that if you are taking care of a child with higher level needs, that may require to see specialists. They will need referrals to specialist physicians. So that can be a little bit of high stress to try and obtain as well. But nonetheless, Health Plan in Nevada does provide a lot of different levels of case management and resources to the families. So it's definitely a plan that I encourage a lot of my caregivers to apply for, because they have a lot of services that they're able to have access to when they sign up for this. Second, we have Anthem Blue Cross Blue Shield, Silver Summit Health Plan, and the newest one is Molina Healthcare. All of these different plans may offer different benefits to whoever signs up for it. We work more so closely with Health Plan in Nevada. They put on a lot of like community events for families. So we've just been able to get really connected with them through just going through a lot of their events and building partnership and relationship there. And that's how I know that they just do a lot. And I think Blue Cross Blue Shield does a bit as well for their caregivers, or I'm sorry, for the children that have signed up for that plan. And it may be somewhat similar to Health Plan in Nevada, but again, that is something that they will let you know about as soon as the child is signed up. Let's go into talking about how a caregiver can access food stamps for their household. So for food stamps, it's important to remember that welfare is looking into the household income. So it's not just based off of the caregiver's income, but it's the household in general. So if he or she is married with a spouse or has like a domestic partner, anything like that, if they live with a roommate, with other family in the home, and they all contribute to the household welfare, may look into that, and everyone's income may be found. So it's a thing to keep in mind. On this chart here, I highlighted in pink, it is meeting the 130th percentile for poverty guidelines. So the household size needs to be, so the amount in pink relates to the household size. So if you have a household size of 4 people, the household income cannot be any greater than the $3,006, which for some of our families, maybe that is where they're at, right? We know that a lot of our families are on a fixed or lower income, and then they would have access to it. Here is the TANF guideline, the TANF income guidelines for relative caregivers. Again, this only applies to individuals who are a blood relative to the child. So we have same thing, household size, and then the income guideline that they cannot go over it. They have to be under that. And so in the purple, we have a household size of 4. Their income cannot exceed the $6,359, which is pretty reasonable, as I said, right? A little bit more manageable and a lot easier to access this level of financial aid, which is $418 for our family. So that is nice. Hopefully one day, maybe in the near future, we can perhaps see how fictive kins can access the same level of aid that relative caregivers can. We're not there yet, but maybe we'll get there one day. Okay, so this is what families will have to do in order to apply for welfare services. So first, they have to make sure that they're actually eligible for the services. And then again, the biggest things that we look into is, are you a blood relative? And then, do you meet the income? One thing that for non-blood relatives, if you are a fictive kin caregiver, you can't have access to Child-Only Tanf, but you can certainly see and apply for food stamps if you meet the income guideline. So that is important to know. So you may have access to food stamps. All right, so after eligibility is verified, clients will set up an appointment, and we recommend coming to foster kinship and working with our advocates, because the Child-Only Tanf application has to be completed a certain way in order for welfare to process it correctly. And we just are really used to working with those forms. We're really knowledgeable about how to get those services approved quickly. So it's always just better to just work with an advocate. Of course, families have a choice and they may be familiar with welfare and their application process and are welcome to do it on their own independently as well. And then we're able to provide support as they need it. Have all necessary supporting documents submitted with their application. So there are quite a hefty amount of supporting documents that welfare requires. It may be the child's birth certificate. So again, if you're not able to provide the birth certificate, they won't know how you are a blood relative. So you may have to identify 3 non-blood relatives that can vouch for you that you are a blood relative, and we will have to sign a letter stating that we contest our blood relative. So that's another way that I have helped caregivers to secure the Child-Only Tanf benefit, is through those letters. If you have any form of income, such as SSI, employment, pay stubs, all of that is going to be required to submit. Sometimes, and I don't know when or how this occurs, but sometimes welfare may ask for bank statements. So you have to be very comfortable with providing a lot of different personal information, right? It's very intrusive when you're trying to establish this state. Recognize the frustration that can cause in our caregivers, because our caregivers are just trying to do the right thing and just trying to get by and get the kids what they need. And then here is different levels of documents that's needed just to get 400. So we really try to work with our caregivers in making sure that they have access to the supporting documents that is needed before we even submit them. So supporting documents also can look like child support paperwork as well. It's called the non-custodial parent form, if I'm remembering the title of that form correctly. They so caregivers are required to comply with child support, that non-custodial form. What that means is you do have to write down any information you know about the parents. It doesn't have to be current, or you don't have to go tracking down their most current information. It's just what you know about their address. What do you know about, like, their phone number, their last communications? It's just things like that that you have to comply with. Some caregivers feel comfortable providing that information. Other people do not, right? Most of the time, our caregivers that are not involved in the CPS system, they recognize that parents are unable to care for the kids perhaps due to a safety reason, but also because of mental health reasons, right? So it really could be not to like make any levels of excuses or offend anybody, but sometimes when it comes to mental health, it's not up to that person to make rational and safe decisions. It's always important to keep that in mind. And for our caregivers, they have perhaps the most empathy when it comes to their relatives, right? In understanding what has led their kids into their home and out of their. So it's reasonable. I never judge anyone when they say that I can't child support. It doesn't feel right, and then we'll explore something else. We'll look into other supportive services to help our caregivers. After all the forms are submitted, they have to attend an interview at the welfare. It says welfare office. I think they're moving towards doing phone appointments now, but it could be the welfare office. It could be over the phone. And then as of recently, foster kinship does have an on-site welfare worker, and we schedule the appointments for our caregivers to meet either directly with our welfare worker in person, or they can choose to do it over the phone with her as well. There is always additional documents that can be needed after. So this is something that I perhaps may not be able to effectively supply to welfare before the appointment. There may be additional documentation that welfare asks for after they've conducted the interview and they've discovered through their interview that there's some forms missing, and they need to be sent by mail. And then the caregiver take those forms and turn it back in within, I believe they have 10 days to do. Child support, of course, as I talked about. So child support, so when you're first applying for TANF, they will ask you about the general questions about the parents' whereabouts. And again, as I said, you just answer what you can from the last note information. After the TANF is granted, after everything is said and done, the child support, the district attorney's office will send you additional documents answering questions about the birth parents, and you do the same thing again. You answer as appropriately and with the last known information that you have, right, on the parents. And then again, there's a due date for additional child support paperwork that's due, and then you have to make sure to turn it in right on time to avoid any disruptions in services. So all of that can be a little bit challenging for our caregivers, and which is why we just step in and we help. We sit down with them, we decipher the child support paperwork with them, and just fill it out to the best of our knowledge and what we know about the parents. And then that is that, really. Let's move into our heaviest conversation on what the legal situation is like for our caregivers. Here is the legal options for informal caregivers. So sometimes we get questions like, how does this even happen? Like how can a child be in out of home care and not have CPS involvement? What leads to this? So there's different factors that can lead to this. There's kinship care is a very gray area. It's very complex because families are complex, right? Like people are complex, and that's okay. But there's several reasons as to why children may be in out of home care. First, there may be a safety issue, right? It could be a domestic violence situation that occurred where perhaps mom was in a relationship and didn't know how to kind of come out of that situation. Domestic violence is a very huge concern in our communities right now, right? There's a lot of different factors that go into survivors of domestic violence and victims of domestic violence situations like that. But one of the things that I have seen is, it's very simple. I'll paint a picture for you. It can be two people are in a relationship, they get into a fight, the cops are called, Metro comes out, right? They see that there's a fight, children have been exposed to this violence, they immediately call CPS. CPS then says, okay, goes to the mall, right? Do you have any family that can take the kids while you sort this out? And then there we have it, right? They may create a safety plan. Safety plan may look like kids are going to be with grandma while mom sorts out her issues with the domestic violence. In so many words, but here, when we get calls like this, one of the things that we do is, okay, how long is the safety? What level of stability does this provide the caregiver? Is it going to truly be short term? The safety plans can be 10 days, can be 15 days. I don't think they're able to extend it for any longer than 30 days. And so there's some policies that surround safety plans as well. And of course, safety plans, just to reiterate, is created by the CPS investigator here. So what must we consider when we're thinking about a safety plan? Is the safety plan going to end? And can the kids then safely go back home? A lot of the times that does not happen in kinship care because family may feel like, you know what, mom still is going back to the boyfriend, right? Or whoever, going back to their partner. And I don't want the kids to be exposed to further violence. Mom may feel like I need a little bit more time to sort out like what's happening. Now I'm having to deal with court or police reports. I'm having to deal with so much. Can you take care of the kids for a little bit longer, right? And that little bit longer then turns into weeks and months, right? So if you're thinking like, well, what about CPS, right? What does that look like on their end? It can go one of two ways, quite honestly. They may ask the parent, and they may assess, not ask, they may assess that, okay, no, the child can safely go back home, right? The safety plan is done. We haven't surveyed for any other danger occurring. That other person that was danger is gone, is left, is in jail. You guys are good now, so the kids can go back, right? And then they go back and perhaps mom may privately ask grandma to still care for the kids while she sorts things out. So CPS may not know this is occurring, right? There's just a lot of different gray areas of situation that can lead into this informal occurrence. Another thing that can happen is CPS may say, well, mom says she's still sorting things out. That's understandable. Grandma, how about you give her 6 months? And this paperwork will allow you to care for the kids temporarily for 6 months, while mom is figuring out what she needs to do. And this leads us to number 2, 6 months temporary guardianship, right? And 6 months temporary guardianship is used for various reasons, not just this scenario, right? But 6 months temporary guardianship is an alternative to legal guardianship. It is meant to be very temporary. It has it in its name. It's only good for 6 months. And it can be null and void whenever the parent decides. It has to be notarized. So that parent has to be able to sign and have it notarized from a notary. But they still have the right to tear that piece of paper up and take their kids back at any point. So it doesn't quite guarantee the safety of the children if we know that safety has. Now, I would say 6 months temporary guardianships are very beneficial in some of the situations where maybe the parent is sick. Maybe the parent has been hospitalized, right? And she has established another relative caregiver to care for the kids while she recovers. Very appropriate. Right? That would be a very appropriate decision to make because the children are not considered unsafe. They just need caregiving while parent gets better. So there's different reasons that maybe temporary guardianship can be a good option. When it comes to safety planning, what we typically do is I will always step in and have a conversation with the investigator. And one of the biggest questions I try to ask is, if there's a safety issue, I don't recommend 6 months temporary guardianship because Temporary guardianship doesn't resolve the safety issue, right? Not truly. It doesn't ensure that safety concern will go away. It doesn't help mom with her relationship issues. It doesn't provide the level of therapy that may be needed for children who have been exposed to violence, right? It doesn't, if parents are using substances, right? It doesn't resolve any of those different areas of issues that are involved in the family system now. So that's the conversation I would have with the investigator is, you know, what is the safety plan really doing? And how is it serving the child and the parent and the caregiver? And we try to kind of not let it go into the private family matter where private would look like, you know, them being encouraged temporary guardianship. It would be, you know, CPS maybe needs to stay involved until mom can sort out her business, and then there needs to be a clear path and a clear plan in place on how the kids can return back to their mom's care with CPS oversight is what I would advocate for in that situation whenever a safety situation is happening. Now let's talk about legal guardianship. The way that legal guardianship occurs is, again, it could be through multiple scenarios. It could be through parents passing away. It could be that previously there was a safety plan early in the removal of the children, right? And CPS maybe closed the case out and surveyed it as safe, assessed it as safe, where kids are able to return back to their parents the minute that CPS stepped out of the home. Mom reached out privately to grandma and asked grandma to take care of the kids for a little bit, and those little bit turned into a year. And then a year passes by and we get a phone call and grandma says, I've been caring for my grandkids for a year. I don't know what to do. It's time to enroll them into school. And they told me to call you guys and I need to get legal guardianship. And this is how this situation occurs. I would like to say, you know, on a rare basis, it happens all the time. It's not rare at all. So what are the steps of establishing a legal guardianship over a minor? Okay. We'll talk about that in just a minute. And now, what happens when caregivers find, you know what, legal guardianship is not for me, temporary guardianship maybe for me, but this sounds like really overwhelming. This sounds so stressful. I just want mom or dad just to get it together, right? Can I just continue caring without any formalization, right? What happens? Well, we aren't really sure because, again, this is an unpaved road, right? We don't know. The outcomes aren't good for kids who don't have any stabilization, right? If caregivers are caring for children privately and they haven't established legal guardianship and they've been caring for kids with an expired temporary guardianship because that temporary guardianship has to be renewed every 6 months and we haven't been able to find parents, then yeah, what can happen, right? That means to me, what that looks like is kids have gone without medical care for a long time because you cannot go into a doctor's office with an expired temporary guardianship, right? I would question the kids being in school, right? Because even the schools are looking into, are you the legal guardian? Who are you, right? What does that look like? The kids wouldn't have access to perhaps needed therapy, right? Therapeutic options or perhaps mental health options, counseling options, because all of those services require legal guardianship. So that tells us that these kids who are in private care with no formalization of established legal capacity with their caregiver, their access to different levels of necessities has been blocked. Private adoption. One of the things that I hear from a lot of our very dedicated guardians is, I'd like to adopt. You know, adoption is a very beautiful thing, but it's a journey, right? And it requires us to be able to think about our commitment to the children and our resources for the children, as well as our attachment to the children. Adoption is what we consider to be a forever situation, right? Forever thing, where that child after adoption will be yours. And a lot of guardians have been caring for children for a really long time when they start thinking about adoption. So we know the commitment and the attachment is there. So what we tend to focus on is, okay, what resources now will be terminated if you take guardianship, or I'm sorry, if you take apply for adoption. So with adoption, access to Medicaid may be impacted, right? Because then after adoption, when that child is recognized as your own, Medicaid will look into your income to see if your income guidelines meet for Medicaid. And then next, child-only TANF. If a relative caregiver is looking into adopting, they will no longer have access to child-only TANF. And one of the biggest things I take a look at is, are you counting on child-only TANF? Are you, is there child support set up for this child? Are you getting child support for your children that you're caring for? All of that is going to be terminated post-adoption. And so, you know, our families think about that and they make the decision to move forward with adoption based off of those circumstances and those factors. There may be non-relative caregivers, meaning kins, right, that are looking into adoption. Adoption is not easy to do when you are a caregiver. It is immensely hard to adopt when you are a non-relative. You will have to hire a lawyer if you are a fictive kin looking to adopt your child, and there's no CPS oversight, right? You're doing this just completely privately, private adoption. You'll have to hire a lawyer and work with an adoption lawyer, and that costs thousands and thousands of dollars, right? Is that something that our families have access to? Very rarely. Same for grandparents. Grandparents have often come to us and would like to adopt the child, right? And adoption paperwork is something that we can support with, but it requires a high level of legal oversight on that to make sure that the paperwork is done correctly. And so we are not lawyers, right? We're really here to support the caregivers in the steps and making sure that they have everything they need to get it done, but it's not where we can sit down and decipher a lot of these legal forms with them because we're not paralegals and we're not lawyers. So then they may have also grandparents may or relative caregivers may also have to make sure that this gets done correctly. Aging out. So aging out of informal care. What happens to children who age out informal care? We again don't know, right? The outcomes are not wonderful because we see that in private caregiving, there is a lot of different level of needs that children have that go unmet, right? As I talked about, they may not have gotten the medical treatment they needed, the therapeutic treatments they needed, because it's just missed, right? We oftentimes may make the assumption that because this child isn't in foster care with a foster parent, that they're going to be okay, and that's not true. Because the thing is, whether a child is in foster care or not, they've gone through trauma, and trauma rewires our brain. And we have a training on the Kinship Institute that talks all about that. And I really encourage you guys to watch that training and understanding why it is really important for our kids to receive therapy and to have that support in their life for ongoing successful outcomes. Okay, let's jump into talking about steps to guardianship. This is Guardianship NRS 159. What that basically means is this is legal guardianship with no financial compensation. So caregivers are not going to get paid if they are the legal guardian of the children. Let's follow this roadmap. So the first thing to do is obtain and locate a packet. So this can be, you can obtain a packet through family court, or you can just contact foster kinship and be helped with these packets. Completing the packet. So what we do on our end is we actually sit down with the caregivers and we cipher the information together and we complete the application together. I typically recommend having the caregiver really put their thoughts together. The packet has some very intense questions on there, some very personal questions on there about why the guardianship is needed, why mom cannot care for their child, why dad cannot care for their child. And the judge is going to look at these answers, and how the questions are answered is really crucial when the judge is making the decision. So I always recommend to caregivers to really sit down, gather their thoughts on like what has led the child into their home and what has led the parent to not be able to care for their child, even if it's just temporarily, right? Like perhaps parents may be able to get better 2 years from now, 5 years from now, a decade from now, right? But it's really focusing on why the parent can't do this right now. So we sit down, we think about it, we decipher the information, we write it down, the paperwork is filed, and then they obtain their court hearing. While their court hearing is being like pending, basically, and court hearings right now book out about a month and a half right now is what it's looking like. And within a month and a half, they have additional steps that they have to follow. So they have to certify mail to the required family, which is mom and dad. Even if they don't know where mom and dad is, by law, they have to certify mail and serve the paperwork to mom and dad and to grandparents and any siblings over the age of 14. This costs money. And so you can probably calculate in your head that this is all starting to cost a little bit more than perhaps what our caregivers on a fixed and low income may be able to just dish out, right? Of course, foster kinship helps pay for these things as well. So we do step in and we do help for paying for mailing as well. But nonetheless, it's still required and it's still something that caregivers have to go through. Then they attend their hearing. Attending hearings can really go 50-50. Right now, the court system is really cracking down and making sure that people are completing the process of obtaining guardianship very correctly. So everything needs to be done perfectly, right? Like all the I's need to be dotted, all the T's needs to be crossed. If any little step is missed, the hearing will be vacated, meaning that the judge will dismiss the case even before the hearing occurred. And then you're kind of back to square one on applying and filing again. And then trying to figure out what step was missed as well. Other than that, some other things that can occur that can hold up the process of guardianship is the certified mailing is not done because it's extremely hard to find parents, right? Sometimes parents don't want to be found, right? Sometimes their last known address was the caregiver's address. And so it looks like grandparents or relative is really not serving the parents, but that's really the address that they used to live at. And now they're homeless. And that's not something that you can just like, overcome. Parents may hire a lawyer. They may not agree to the guardianship and may object, and it can get really complicated when they hire a lawyer. The paperwork may be done incorrectly, and then in return, if addresses are not found and parents are not served, the judge may order a publication. And in return, the publication costs $100. And there's different nuances that are set up to completing a publication. And then makes it hard to even get the publication done because I wouldn't say it's complicated, it's just additional steps that now caregivers have to take in order to get it done. But we can talk about that. So for publication, a judge does have to order it. You take that order, you take it to Nevada Legal News, which is a newspaper that no one reads, but that is the policy. And you submit that order and you pay them the fine, and they will run an ad that a guardianship hearing is upcoming for a child, etc., etc. They forward the proof of publication that you did it to the court, so that's kind of nice, so you don't have to worry about that. The newspaper will do that for you, and then you again wait for your court hearing, and the judge sees that you've done this, and then pray to God that your guardianship and nothing else can go wrong there, right? There may be other things that come up where there is a gap attorney, which is a guardianship attorney, pro bono lawyers that are assigned to your kinship child's guardianship case. They may not agree with the guardianship, right? And it may not be anything personal. They just may feel like this needs to be a CPS case or something, or maybe parents are able to take care of the kids and they really like the parents to step back in, just care for their kids. It could be different reasons why the gap attorneys may not agree to the guardianship, but it can happen, right? It's kind of rare because they really do understand why kids need the guardianship, so they really fight for these things, but it's not unheard of. There also may be out-of-state issues. This is one of the biggest challenges that I have had in my time working with caregivers to help them with guardianship. Sometimes we have caregivers that move to Las Vegas. We are a transient state, right? They move to Las Vegas and they've already have guardianship in a different state. And they did not know to get approval from their court system in that state to then provide to our court system. In the event that that happens, our court system will not approve your guardianship because there's a guardianship already in effect, essentially, in a different state. So legal guardianships do not transfer from state to state, and that's really important to remember. You do have to get court approval to move children, and then take that court approval and supply it to your current state that you live in, or that you're trying to move to, and then reestablish guardianship for this state. And that's really hard to do when you're trying to work with two different court systems. It's really complicated. Okay, so those are some challenges with guardianship and the guardianship process as a whole. Okay, let's talk about types of emotional support. So I spend a lot of time providing emotional support to my caregivers. I love to just kind of get to know what's happening, how we can serve them, what's led them into the situation, and just kind of like get their perspective on what's kind of going on. So what does it mean to provide caregivers with emotional support, and why is providing emotional support for caregivers and to helping professionals, right? So goal one in how to provide emotional support, right? So we need to be able to empathize with our caregivers, and it's important to remember that our caregivers did not choose to be in this situation, right? I feel like there's this misconception that family needs to just step up for their family, and that's not fair. That's a thought process that has just led us into a really difficult position now for a lot of our families. Caregivers process what is happening in this situation. It takes time, right? They're trying to make sense of what's happening with the parents. What do the kids need? What do I do next? How do I afford this? What am I going to tell my job? How am I going to make it with my $700 on my SSI? Like, They have a lot on their minds. A lot of times our caregivers who are taking guardianship or caring for children privately with no CPS involvement are grieving, right? Well, anyone in the situation can be grieving, but perhaps they're grieving due to the parents being deceased, right? So they're actively in their grief and trying to figure out how to then navigate this private family care. And it starts with understanding the family dynamics of the caregiver, of the children, of the parents. One of the things that a lot of times professionals and caregivers have a hard time with is empathizing with the biological parents, right? And that's a whole another conversation. But just to expand on it just a little bit for this conversation, birth parents are going through a lot themselves, right? Like for a woman or for a man who is in a domestic violence relationship, right? It takes a lot of different levels of support, counseling, and realization to come out of a toxic relationship. Being in a toxic relationship is like using substances. It's very addictive, right? And there's highs and there's lows that keep you in those terrible relationships that we just don't see it yet, right? There may be mental health issues with birth parents, right? It could have been triggered postpartum, right? We don't talk enough about birth parents, or I'm sorry, with women and giving birth and the side effects or the health complications or how our bodies are impacted after birth, right? And all of that can be really challenging to be a new mom or a mom at all, right? To a newborn baby. So there's just too many challenges for us to be able to just expect people just to jump in or to make judgment, and it's just, it doesn't get us anywhere. It doesn't solve problems, and it doesn't help families, and it doesn't help children. Goal 2, connecting with community and practicing humility. One of the things that I always try to remember when I am working with families is that my families are in a really difficult situation that they'll continue to deal with even when I step out of their home, right? Or I end this phone call, their problems do not stop. Their problems are going to continue. Right? So when I am working with my families and helping them, it's really just making sure that I am able to do everything in my power, right, to get them the services that they need for themselves, for their kids, and maybe even for their birth parent, right? What are the circumstances? What has led the child out of their parental care? Does relative have adequate resources and understanding to care for the child? So one thing that can be hard to do is having a conversation with the caregiver, especially when they're caring for older children. Parenting in this day and age is parenting in general is challenging, and then parenting in an age of technology and social media is just almost impossible. There's a lot of different conversations that I have with caregivers and making sure that they understand cyberbullying, right? Like if you're taking care of a teenager, like I may tailor my conversation with my caregivers based off of the age group they're caring for to really make sure that they understand their children and the circumstances now that they're in, right? And just kind of having a more trauma-informed approach and having the conversation with this caregiver. Goal 3 is communicate, explain, and encourage asking for help. So one thing that we run into is a lot of our families may not be comfortable seeking help from either a government entity or just community organizations. Sometimes in certain cultures, so we have to have cultural humility as well, right? And sometimes in certain cultures, asking for help is considered weak, or we have mistrust in our government, rightfully so, because we have a lot of turmoil that's currently happening politically. It makes sense, right? So one thing that I try to do is first build rapport with my caregivers, explain options to them, and it's not to sway them in one way or another, It's really to make sure that they have the most information they can have and be able to process that information very adequately and reasonably in a form where they're going to make the best decision for not just their child, but their whole family, really. So it's explaining all the options to care. I even go through like pro and con lists with a lot of my care, right? Pros of being a legal guardian, cons of being a legal guardian, pros of temporary guardianship, cons of temporary guardianship, all of those. Like we'll sit down and we'll talk about that. And then available resources for each. So we do have community resources that may be supportive to the family system, right? Access to free clothing. I always make sure, and all of the advocates at Foster Kinship, one of the first things that we do after we get off the phone with our caregivers after doing an intake and assessment is we provide them with a list of free resources that they'll be able to access immediately, right? So that's going to be access to clothing. And then there is food banks. There is an organization that also helps with food assistance for grandparents, door to door, grocery deliveries, right? So we immediately connect them to those levels of supportive community services that they're going to need. There's organizations out there that help teenagers with prom outfits. It's all those little things that you would never think about that someone's going to need help with, and then we help them with it, right? We help them get connected because that's what it's going to take in order to make sure that we can really have children who are going to be able to thrive in out of home care. So those are some different levels of things that we need to consider at, on a professional scale when we are working with informal families. And then one of the things that we do is make sure that our community, including our community partners, caregivers, volunteers, anyone we are working with has access to our community resource locator tool. This is a really handy dandy tool that is simplified to enter in your age, children's age, your zip code, and it will pop up the nearest options to get free clothing, baby essentials, connecting with other caregivers, housing and space for children, healthy food for development, and then respite for caregivers, which Foster Kinship does provide respite services for all of our kinship caregivers at no cost at all. So these are really different levels of services that we have seen from our kinship navigator model that really secures the family system a bit more. There's still a lot of work that needs to be done, right? But it starts with the foundation, and the foundation is building rapport, building trust, and then securing our families with necessities, right? To really allow them to then think about other things other than how am I going to feed and clothe, right? As soon as we can resolve the basic issues surrounding the situation, then we can really tackle the big issues, is how I see it. And if you'd like to learn a little bit more about, again, trainings that we have at Foster Kinship, including trauma-informed training, which I talked a bit about trauma-informed care, it is all available on our Kinship Institute training, and here is the website. You can also find us on our Facebook group as well. And if you have any questions, thoughts, you are always welcome to email me. And I love conversing about all things kinship related, all things with private care related. I'm very passionate about it. And then, yes, if you have any clarifications, if you wanted access to this PowerPoint, if you wanted access to the eligibility website that we have, just email me, sasha@fosterkinship.org. And that concludes our training on informal family caregiving and all the resources available to our family. Thank you, guys.